So welcome everyone to the webinar today. I'm Jim Lindberg. I'm Senior Policy Director at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to our National Trust Preservation Leadership Forum webinar this afternoon, using the CARE tool to calculate carbon savings from reuse. So if you don't know, Preservation Leadership Forum is the professional membership program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And this webinar series is made possible by Preservation Leadership Forum members. So we want to thank those members who are with us today. The webinar is also being co-hosted by our friends at Architecture 2030. And if you don't know about them, they are a nonprofit organization whose mission is to rapidly transform the built environment from the major emitter of greenhouse gases to a central solution to the climate crisis. And you'll be hearing from several members of Architecture 2030 here in a moment. Our webinar today is also brought to you by the Preservation Priorities Task Force, which is a collaboration between the National Trust for Historic Preservation and our friends at the National Preservation Partners Network, NPPN. Some of you who may have participated in the webinar that the Preservation Priorities Task Force hosted just about a year ago, in which we previewed this innovative tool, the CARE tool, which is now available for public use. So in today's webinar, the creators of that tool are going to walk you through the steps you can use to put this tool to work for your projects and in your community. So before we start, just a few technical logistics today. We're going to be taking questions, and we're going to have hopefully a good bit of time for Q&A at the end here. Send your questions to the Q&A function. So that'll go directly to the panelists. And you can submit those questions at any time during the webinar. And then at the end, we'll go through and answer as many as we can. And you're also encouraged to use the chat function to chat with each other. All the participants will see that. But again, if you have questions for the panelists, send those through to the Q&A. And then everyone always asks, but yes, we will have a recording of today's webinar available shortly after the program today. So feel free to go back and look at that. Those are archived on our National Trust Preservation Leadership Forum YouTube channel, and we'll share that link in the chat as well. So what we have planned for today, moving pretty quickly, we'll be first to hear from Erin McDade from Architecture 2030. Erin leads Architecture 2030's public policy and embodied carbon initiatives, focusing in particular on developing data-driven solutions for building sector decarbonization, which is a priority. Erin is also one of the co-creators, along with Lori Ferris and Larry Strain, of the CARE tool, which you're going to be hearing about. Erin's going to provide a bit of background briefly on the connections between buildings and carbon emissions, how the CARE tool can help us better understand those connections, and more about how Architecture 20 is working to develop and promote the CARE tool for use around the country. Erin will then introduce her co-creators, Lori Ferris and Larry Strain, and Lori will walk us through some examples of how this tool could be put into practice, both for individual projects and actually for a larger campus, a group of buildings on a campus. And then at the end, then finally, Erin will come back and actually do a walkthrough of how you can use the CARE tool and apply it to projects and places that you care about, and get you started with this and let you explore it. And then finally, following that demonstration, we do hope to have a good bit of time for Q&A. So with that start, I will now turn it over to Erin. Erin?
All right, thanks for the introduction, Jim, and thanks for the invitation to have us on here presenting today. And Architecture 2030 is thrilled to be co-hosting this event, and I am really happy to see how many participants have shown up. We are really excited about the CARE tool. I think all of us would agree that it's been one of the most rewarding things that we've worked on in recent years, and so I'm really happy to be getting to share it out with more people who can hopefully benefit. So Like Jim said, I'm going to start with a little bit of context on why we're having this conversation at all, and what kind of the climate impetus behind the CARE tool was. So I like to start my talks, regardless of what they're about, with this slide, because I think it's really important for all of us to keep this in mind as we're doing any work in the building sector moving forward. And this is a little bit of information from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on where we are in terms of global carbon emissions and what our climate targets need to be to try to stay in line with Paris Agreement numbers. So on a regular basis, on an annual basis, we emit about 40 gigatons of carbon per year. This data started at 2020, and that really has not changed very much since 2020. Unfortunately, we would hope it had gone down, but it hasn't really. And in order to stay within the 340 to 400 gigatons that the IPCC says we need to stay under to have our best chance of meeting 1.5 degrees C, what that means is that we really need a global reduction in all emissions. And I want to be clear here, we're talking about all global emissions in this context, not just building sector emissions, but these targets apply to the building sector as well. We need a 50 to 65% reduction in global emissions by 2030, and then zero emissions by 2040. And if we do this, this keeps us right on line with that 1.5 degrees C target. It is our best chance of meeting 1.5 degrees C. And I will say that, there's a lot of news coming out lately about if we're going to cross this threshold when we are going to pretty soon. Even if we cross the threshold, the sooner we can peak our emissions and the sooner we can get to zero, the better it's going to be for everyone in the long term. So when I'm doing my work, I am constantly looking at this 0 by 2040 target and framing everything through that lens. And so I want to us to keep that in mind as we're continuing the rest of this conversation. So in the design world, there is a truism that the greenest building is one that's already built. And I can give a quick demonstration of why that is here. If we look at the carbon footprint of an average new building, this is just, very high level information, could be a new building anywhere in the world. What we see is that on the day, the day before it is operated, during the construction process, all of these embodied carbon emissions are emitted to get that building up. And those carbon emissions are just in the atmosphere in perpetuity, absent any sort of drawdown, obviously. And then on the day that the building starts operating, those operational emissions start, and those are cumulative every year, and they build up as well. And so if we're looking at a building constructed, in this case, again, in 2020, and drawing our line in the sand at 2040, our 0 year, we see that even then, even with those cumulative additive operational emissions, the embodied carbon is still 59, almost 60% of the total emissions pie for this new building. And so what this means is that if instead of building this new building from scratch and emitting all this embodied carbon right here, we had simply reused an existing building, this green section would be significantly lower. But that's only half of the side of the coin. So yes, significantly better to reuse a building, but then we still are faced with the issue of the operating emissions from those existing buildings. And when we step back a bit and look at this from a bigger picture, we see that because of those operational emissions of existing buildings, in most urban environments across the world, especially in cities with large developed existing building stocks, buildings are responsible for the majority of emissions. And you can get a snapshot of that from a bunch of different examples across the world here. And if you take that one step further back and look at it from a full global perspective, what we see are that projections indicate that in 2040, our 0 year, 2/3 of the global building stock will be buildings that exist today. And so that means that most of the buildings in 2040 are going to be existing, and they are, without any interventions, still going to be emitting carbon because of those operations. And so if we don't upgrade those buildings, and if we don't get rid of those operational emissions from that massive existing building stock, we're not going to meet our climate targets. So I'd posit that instead of the greenest building being one that's already built, the greenest building is one that's been retrofitted. And that is the impetus behind the CARE tool from a high level perspective. From a more personal perspective, I'll introduce the team right now and give a little bit of a background of how the CARE tool actually came about. My colleague Larry Strain, who's a founding principal at Siegel and Strain Architects in the Bay Area in California, has former colleague who was with the Office of the President of the UC system and came to him and said something along the lines of, we're really interested in looking at all of our buildings on all of our campuses and doing an analysis to consider if it would make more sense for us to reuse specific buildings or tear them down and build new. From a carbon perspective, what tool do we need to use to make that happen? And Larry said, I don't think a tool like that exists, but I'll make one. And so he put together an Excel calculator and started kind of shopping that around to the rest of the, our little sustainability building cohort that we have across the country, and brought it to me at a conference. And I was super excited by it, and decided that I could, I'm a bit of an Excel nerd, and so I decided that I could potentially even make it better, and went in and added a bunch of operational carbon data to support his embodied carbon data. And I think you all saw it pretty quickly around that point, where we developed into a pretty cool but still pretty rudimentary Excel calculator. And it was along that time that Lori Ferris, who's a principal and director of sustainability and climate action at Goody Clancy, she has a strong focus on preservation architecture, came into the picture to really help us solidify, especially the embodied carbon backend data of the calculator. And because of that, and because of, I think it should be my next slide here. Yep, because of tremendous support we got from collaborators within our building sustainability cohort, including Carbon Leadership Forum, CNCC, the EPIC tool, and then some wonderful support that we got from the philanthropy community, as well as some architecture firms. We were able to, within a pretty quick period of time, turn the CARE tool into this online app that we're going to be looking at now. And it is really exciting how far it has come from that first Excel version that some of you may have seen. So a quick dialogue about what the CARE tool does, a little bit about what it doesn't do and who it's for, and then we'll dive into looking at it. So the high-level goal for the CARE tool is to be a very early design tool, even pre-design tool that evaluates the total carbon emissions and impact potential of existing building reuse compared to replacing new construction. So when you're at the phase in the conversation, like Larry's colleague in the UC system, where they were saying, do we even need to build new, or should we retrofit? This is when you want to be using the CARE tool. It is not, unlike some other tools that would come later in the design process, a detailed energy modeling tool. It is a comparison tool. So the numbers that come out of it are valuable as comparison metrics. They are not necessarily, once you do a whole building LCA tally model later in the design process, the numbers might not be identical. It's also not a whole building LCA tool for various reasons. We can talk about that a little bit if it comes up. And unlike some tools that some of you might be used to, for example, if you use Tally a lot, you can't override the backend data. Again, there are reasons for that. We can talk about it if valuable. But the tool, we put in as many default outputs in the tool as possible to allow it to be as easy to use as possible, especially if folks don't have a lot of information at this early design phase. But you can override default outputs within the interface in case you do have more detailed information, such as an energy model with projected EUIs already. And we really wanted the tool to be very broadly applicable, and we have a lot of plans for future expansion of the tool to make it even more applicable in some of these specific contexts. But our goal is for it to be certainly valuable to designers as another tool in their suite that they use to help make this really critical reuse and new construction decision. But even beyond that, even for folks who might not be as in depth in the building community or the design, specifically community public officials, planners, heritage officers, real estate developers, etc. The tool is still usable to them. It does not require an in-depth knowledge of how buildings work to be able to get valuable information out of it. So quickly looking at what is contained within the tool. And this, I think, is information or valuable information as an overall snapshot. But when we go through the demo, it'll become clear how a lot more of this works. But the tool comes in, it's on the homepage of caretool.org, and there are 4 different tabs with some basic information that you fill in, and you get outputs right away as soon as some of the information is inputted that are dynamic and update as you add more info. And on the general information tab, some, again, very high level information about the location and about grid emission scenarios. So this will help determine your energy use intensity and your operational emissions, et cetera. On the existing building tab, this is where information is inputted about the building that you're considering either tearing down and replacing or renovating. And so put in some high level information about what the building looks like, et cetera. This is one of those examples where it'll output default EUIs and emissions numbers that can be overridden or not. Then on the building reuse tab, this is where we start to look at, okay, what are the hypotheticals here? So if we are going to reuse this existing building, what might we do to impact both the operational energy and emissions, as well as the embodied carbon? These are, these are the inputs that are really going to determine what the embodied carbon outputs are. Again, we'll talk about the details of this when we look at the demo, but information on if, how much of the structure can be saved versus upgraded, envelope similarly. And then finally on the new building tab, same concept, right? If we are going to tear this building down and reuse and build something completely new, what is that going to look like? And then again, there are some questions that'll determine operational energy and emissions, and some questions that'll help answer the embodied carbon questions. So what this actually looks like once you got into caretool.org, quickly, this is the first page where you enter the project information and some climate information. Then that existing building page, start to answer some questions about what the building looks like, what the type of structure is. There are some default, again, outputs where this is value, this is a metric that does have a significant impact on the outputs, but default information is provided. So if you don't know or don't even really know what this means, you can ignore it, or you can get a little more detailed. The building reuse tab, we'll talk about this a little bit more when we do the demo. This is where you can also provide information if you want to reuse the building, but expand it, make it bigger, change the use type, et cetera. And at the bottom, there's embodied carbon questions, and then the new buildings tab. And once you enter all that information, this is what you get as an output. And so in this example, we see here, first you get an output that is a snapshot in time. And on the very first tab, we'll see this when we do the demo. One of the critical questions that we put on that first tab and that we think is just so important to be asking for all of these types of analyses is, what is the time frame that you want to consider this analysis for? And for whole building LCAs, if any of you have ever done one of those, you know that the typical is to do for the whole life of the building. So 80 to 100 years, maybe as low as 60 years. But we think that because we have that very critical climate deadline of 0 by 2040, and we have these very kind of short-term carbon emissions goals that we need to accomplish, while of course still considering long-term goals, it's really important to make sure that we're drawing lines in the sand. And so we have this snapshot in time where you can determine how many years you want to look at. And of course that can be changed. So for this example, I put us at 17 years, which would take us right to 2040. So our 0-year deadline. And so the first output you see is emissions for if we did nothing to that existing building, we just let it keep going, operating as is. The light blue is operational emissions. We can see for 17 years, it's however many emissions this is, it's a decent amount. Then for our retrofit scenario or reuse scenario, we can see that the operational emissions are significantly reduced. They are not all the way down to 0 carbon, but we have saved a lot of carbon emissions by retrofitting that building. But those retrofits did come into a little bit of an embodied carbon cost. And for the new building, we see that we got those operational emissions down even farther. Still didn't achieve zero operating emissions, which we should be aiming to do, but for the purposes of this example, but because it is so much more embodied carbon heavy to build a new building than to reuse, the embodied carbon penalty, if you will, for getting our new building operational emissions that low was significant enough that it is still fewer emissions overall to reuse, even though our operational emissions are higher for this reuse. And just a little bit of a different way of looking at it here, this is cumulative emissions over time. And we can see each of the scenarios, our do nothing scenario, our new building scenario, and our retrofitted building scenario. And it's just, interesting to see some analysis here. We can see that it takes a little over 6 years for the new building to be more climate smart, if you will, than the do nothing building. And it takes a little under 2 years for the retrofitted building to be better than the do nothing building. And these two lines never even meet up, at least not in this snapshot of time frame. So that is what you will see. And again, I'm going to do a live demo, so we will get to see all this in action, but now you have a sense of the outputs you will be looking for. There's also a data table below this that contains all of the metrics in data format. And before I pass it to Lori to talk about some examples of this is just a quick snapshot of what you will see the second you get to caretool.org, and the tool is right here on the homepage. So you just literally go to caretool.org and scroll down a little bit, and the tool is right there. Okay, Lori, take it away.
Thanks, Erin. So I'm going to briefly go through a couple of examples of use cases for the tool. First, looking at a single building, and then how does that scale up looking at an entire campus. So this building is a project that we completed around 2015. It is on Boston University's campus at the edge of a historic district. It's significant as one of the few international style buildings within the city of Boston. It was purpose-built as a Hillel Center, which had moved into a new building. So the campus was trying to understand, what do we do with this building? What is it suited for? And so it was converted. We did a comprehensive renewal, converting it into the new admissions center, which meant really kind of turning what had been a fairly inward-looking building into a very public building that many, many people pass through daily. Next slide. And so the scope of the renovation, because it was really a comprehensive renovation, we could do a pretty significant amount of upgrading within the building without impacting greatly the historic exterior. So there are new high performance windows throughout. We were able to insulate the inside face of the exterior masonry walls as well as the roof, and put in new high efficient systems, almost all electric, not quite all electric at the time. And through this upgrade, we were able to reduce the building's energy use by about 70%, making it comparable to a pretty high performance new construction at the time. But through that, we were also able to preserve and reuse 86% of the building's structure and enclosure. And because structure and enclosure are the two most carbon intensive parts of a building, those are really the critical pieces that you want to maintain from an environmental standpoint. Next slide. So just to kind of show you how this looks in the tool before the live demo, you can see first on the left, the general information, so where the building is, and then on the right, information about the existing building, how big it is, what's it constructed of, what's it used for, and we're using the default EUI, energy use intensity, that is embedded within the CARE tool. Next slide. So next, we fill in the building reuse information. And as you'll see during the demo, this is the most intensive part of using the CARE tool because as all of you who work with existing buildings know, there are basically an infinite number of ways that we can reuse buildings. So what we do here is talk about first, again, the size of the building. Is there an addition? In this case, we did add a small circulation addition as well as a penthouse. So we indicate that added square footage here. There was no change of use, but we were able to, again, achieve those significant energy reductions. And then in the embodied, on the right-hand side here, you can see the embodied carbon values associated with the amount of intervention required for the structural system, the building envelope, the all new building interiors, and our high-performance MEP systems. Next slide. And then lastly, we input information about the new building. So here we've made it the same size, the same use, I've just for the sake of argument, improved the efficiency of the new building about 15% better than the renovation, because that's always a question we get asked is, wouldn't a new building be more efficient? So even if it wouldn't be, we'd like to just, show what that would look like if it were. And then the embodied carbon, you can see of a sort of standard new commercial construction of this size, steel concrete. And here we see the results. And this is looking at over 15 years. And you can see on the left, again, those cumulative emissions for the duration. We can see that over this timeline, even with the more efficient new building, the reuse and addition is still the lower carbon option during this time frame. And again, on the right, you can see how that plays out over time. And the fact that the renovation has a payback of about 2 years, which is a really good carbon payback and fairly standard for what we see when we do this type of assessment. Next slide. And one of the interesting things you'll see about the tool as Aaron does the demo is that you can get the results for the project, but you can also kind of play around with some of the variables. So here, this is just to give you a sense of a couple of the variables you can investigate. On the left is the as-built renovation that we performed. On the middle says, well, what if that new building weren't really high performance? What if it were just kind of code, code to code, best practices new construction or standard practices new construction? You can see there that that really changes the equation a lot. And in fact, the new construction is now looking much worse than the renovation and almost as bad as just not touching the existing building at all during this 15 years. And then on the right, when you turn on greening of the grid, you can see the emissions for both of those buildings start to come down, the total emissions. So just again, a few of the variables that you can explore. Next slide. So one of the things that's really interesting about this is that obviously you can make a certain amount of impact building by building, but we're really interested in what kind of impact can you make if you look at the district scale, the campus scale, the urban scale. So this is a case study that we performed with Agnes Scott College. They're a small women's liberal arts college outside of Atlanta in Decatur, Georgia. And their campus is part of a landmark district. So they're really proud of their historic campus. And it's a major part of their identity of how the alums, feel connection to Agnes Scott, they really attribute this historic feel of their campus, their Arboretum campus, to the success of their programs. Next slide. So one thing that's kind of interesting about this campus is that deliberately or not, they've taken a stewardship approach to growth, and by that I mean that over time, as the campus has grown, as standards for education have evolved, they have, of course, added many buildings to their campus, added a lot of square footage, but they've also reused their existing buildings in a really smart way. And that includes repurposing them, changing the programmatic use, moving buildings, moving existing buildings out of the way when a new building was needed in a certain location. So really investing a lot of money in stewarding the existing buildings that they already had. Next slide. So first, what we wanted to do is understand, retrospectively, looking from the founding of the campus through the present day, what's the impact, the avoided carbon impact of that stewardship approach? And what we found using the CARE tool across their entire portfolio of buildings is that they've avoided emissions approximately 34,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide of just embodied carbon from reusing their existing buildings rather than replacing them over time. And to put this into context, they have a 100-acre Arboretum campus. They would have to plant that entire campus with forest and grow it for 400 years to sequester, to draw down that amount of carbon. Next slide. But that's retrospective, which is sort of interesting, but how can it be used how can the CARE tool and this data be used as a decision-making driver moving forward? So here we're kind of looking at 2007, which is the year that the campus committed to achieving carbon neutrality, through the year 2037, which is their 0 year. And what you can see there are 4 scenarios. The 3 on the top are looking at scenarios where you do nothing to the existing buildings in gray. In red, and then the red and light green are looking at the sort of renewal cycle of most campuses, where about every 40, 50 years, buildings reach a natural point at which they have to be holistically renewed. And so this is looking at the question, when buildings reach that 40 to 50 year mark, do you reuse them or do you build new? And you can see in red, if you build new every 40 to 50 years for each building, those spikes represent the embodied carbon of that new construction. And you can see that they are very large relative to the whole operational portfolio of the campus, whereas the light green has much smaller spikes associated with reuse. But you'll notice that neither of those lines gets terribly close to zero. And so this is going back to that point Aaron made about the greenest building being the one that it's retrofitted. That darker green line shows a scenario that involves both reusing buildings at the end of their life and making energy efficiency improvements across the entire campus. So this is things, like the low-hanging fruit, installing LED light bulbs, retro commissioning, impacting user behavior, all of these things that we can employ, all these strategies we can employ to reduce energy use. And that is the line that really gets us to net zero with really kind of a low amount of embodied carbon expended to get there. Next slide. And what we see when we just look at that previous graph, but if we look at it in terms of total carbon emitted during that 30-year window, we see that if we just build new in an attempt to get to net zero, we're only going to save about 3% of the carbon that we would have emitted by doing nothing at all, as opposed to if we take that approach of both reusing and improving energy efficiency, we see a savings of 41% of emissions. So this has been really helpful information for the campus. They've actually used it for fundraising. The president of the institution has gotten really excited about embodied carbon, which I personally love. And I think there's a link, or there will be a link in the chat to a blog post that they wrote about this. All right, back to Aaron for the live demo.
That was so fascinating, Lori. I know I've seen that a couple of times, but I'm just always so amazed at how well you can demonstrate the impact potential there. Okay, so I'm gonna switch over to doing a live demo, and I know there are some questions in the chat. I haven't had a chance to look at them, but it's possible that some of these will be answered by doing the live demo, but we're also getting to the point in the talk where this is going to become a bit more informal, and people, I'll start walking through the demo, but I'm happy to take questions kind of at any point now, especially if they're related to the tool specifically. And I'm just going to show how easy this is. I'm just doing this completely on the fly here for you. I don't have this mapped out. So you just go to caretool.org. Like I said, you get to that home page. I'll talk a little bit about kind of all the supporting materials in a second here. But you scroll right down, and here's the tool. And I'll name it. You really don't have to name it, but we'll say this is the CARE headquarters. And it's in the United States. Currently, it's worth noting that we don't have any other countries in here. This is something that is in high demand, is for us to provide availability in other regions. There are some workarounds for that if you want to look at projects outside of the United States that I can talk about if anyone's interested. So for now, I'm gonna put this in Colorado, partly because I'm from there, but also because they have a more intense electricity grid, which is interesting to look at the impact of that. Okay, and then here is where this is all the information the tool needs now to output EUI information. It is using the Architecture 2030 Zero tool, which is the baseline setting tool that most designers in the country use. So you can just leave it as default, or if you want to, you can enter your own information. This is one of the pathways for a workaround to using it outside of the country as well. You can calculate, and here's some information on how to do so, your project specific heating degree day and cooling degree days, and then enter that here, and that will override this zip code information, which is what is telling the tool what your climate information is. But again, I'm going to leave it for default. And then this is something that we added to the tool somewhat recently. Before we just had backend eGrid data. So whatever the 2020 maybe or 2022 eGrid emissions were, that was what it assumed the electricity grid for your project would be for the entire model timeframe. Now we have other options here where you can select scenarios that show different potential grid decarbonization, or at least emissions reduction, intensity reductions, or you can enter your own grid decarbonization year. This is another thing that's valuable if you're either looking at projects outside the US, or if you are looking at something like the campus, like Agnes Scott that Lori showed. Their 0 year was, I think she said 2037. So we could say too, like maybe that campus plans to be fully powered by renewable electricity by 2037. So you can kind of customize that here. For now, I'm gonna do a high renewables case. Yeah, I'm gonna do mid-case renewables here. Doesn't really matter. And then the model time frame defaults to 25, but I'm gonna stick with my 17 because that is our 0 year. Then you just hit continue and it'll automatically click to the next tab, or else you can switch between tabs and it of course retains all of your information. So let's invent a building here. I'm gonna say it's 20,000 square feet. We'll do 6 floors above grade and 1 below grade. And we're going to say it's a steel and concrete structure. I'm going to leave window to wall ratio as default. Note that there are these information eyes all throughout. We added them whenever we thought there would be any question. And so they all contain a lot of information either about our backend assumptions for this or guidance on how to make the right selection for each of these. So we'll say that this building is, I mean, I said it's the care headquarters, so we're probably going to do mostly office, but let's say there's some secondary use type. And we can see that that right there was enough information for the chart to start generating already. Obviously, they're not fully filled in yet because we haven't put in embodied carbon information for the reuse, and we haven't put in any new building information yet, but moving forward, these charts will start dynamically updating as we add more information. And you can also, again, then go switch between tabs, go back and say, oh, let's change this to 15 instead, and it'll make updates like that. So we'll say it's an office, and let's do something fun. Let's say it has a bowling alley in it too, because why not? And so we already said that the total floor area was 20,000. Since it didn't know I was going to add a second use type, it just assumes that the office is 20,000, but I'll say, no, we're going to do a 3,000 square foot bowling alley. And so that'll automatically update that floor area there. And then it will automatically output what it thinks the existing building EUI would probably be. Again, you have a couple of choices here. You can either enter your own EUI if somehow you already know that, or since presumably these are, real existing buildings, you may have utility data. You can go ahead and enter utility data and get your actual EUI there too. I'm going to stick with default for now. And then we'll continue. And so now this is the tab that Lori pointed out as the most intensive. It does take the most consideration here. To keep it a little bit simpler, I'm not going to add an addition, but we already saw Lori's example of how you can add an addition, what that looks like, just a little bit more information required. I will say there'll be a change of use. Let's say there will be. Maybe instead of our bowling alley, we want to turn it into what? Let's turn it into a curling rink. Why not? So now you get to make some choices that will significantly impact operational emissions. And we included everything we think one would need to input to be as accurate as possible. So first, you can set your energy efficiency target. So just how much you want to reduce your EUI. We'll do about a 30% reduction. But then you can also make choices about renewables and about electrification. So I'm going to say that we are electrifying this building. And so we can see that that is going to drop it down a little bit. Means the grid is still not super clean. And we can go clean the grid up on that first tab if we want to look at what it would look like with a clean grid. So we can say, because it's all electric, we're going to generate and procure 50% of that with renewables. And you could see here how if you wanted to model what it would look like to have a zero operating carbon building, that would be pretty easy to do by balancing these three pieces correctly: enough energy efficiency, all electric, and then procuring enough renewables. And then we get to the embodied carbon questions. So the first question is, how much of the structure will be reused or replaced? I'm going to bring it back down so we can see this chart a little bit, because this is probably going to be the most impactful one for this building. And the more we can reuse or replace, of course, the less embodied carbon emissions there will be. So I'm going to say think that's maybe a little bit more. I mean, we didn't change it too much. Oh, sorry, my bad. I was looking at this the opposite direction. So 100% means there's full replacement. So we want to do less. So we'll say we're retaining about 75% of it. We're only replacing about 25% of it. Since we're in Colorado, we're not going to need to do lateral upgrades. Then we look at envelope reuse, and we have 3 questions here. So what extent for the exterior walls? And there are a set of kind of specific enough conditions that we think they should apply to almost every use case here based on a lot of external feedback we've gotten. So I will say we'll do a medium. Masonry repair, and then windows and glazing. We'll reglaze the frames here. Roofing. We'll just restore repair. And if you need to insulate walls, there's a little guidance about this. You can check that box. Then interior reuse, again, another series of sliders, the extent of restoration or refurbishment with information about what that means, extent of new finishes, and then extent of rebuilding reconfiguration, again, information about what that means. So I'm just going to choose not too much new finishes, and then some decent rebuilding reconfiguration here. Then MEP, again, information about what to choose here. And you'll notice, sorry, I should have clarified. You'll notice that as I'm making these selections, it is calculating the embodied carbon, the embodied emissions intensity for each of these subsections right here. And again, we'll say, actually for this one, since I said we're electrifying, we probably are going to need to be replacing all of the systems. So that one's going to be a higher impact. And then we have this set of modifiers here, where you can choose some things that will further impact emissions, whether it will add to them or subtract from them. So if we're using low emissions concrete, that's of course going to reduce our embodied emissions a bit. Responsibly sourced timber, not going to apply as much in this project. And we'll say that we are doing a high performance electrical system. And then finally takes us to our new building tab. This will be a lot easier to input.
And my suggestion is that we pause here unless you feel like we really need to see the new building.
I don't think we probably do. And I can just quickly input some information through here and we can start taking questions while I'm doing that. I'm more than happy to do that.
Yeah. I think that might be good just because I imagine this audience is particularly interested in what you ran through on the rehab scenario. And then maybe you can quickly build us a new building while we're taking a few questions.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
So I'm going to jump to some of those questions, but first let me just say, wow, this is so great to see. There has been a lot of progress made since we previewed the beta version of this tool a year ago, and just credit to all of you, Aaron, Lori, and Larry, the silent partner today, Larry Strain, who had a lot to do with this as well. And I mean, what you guys have built here is so exciting to see. So thank you for the work, and thank you for providing something I think all of us can benefit from. I think there have been a lot of really interesting and important questions raised on the chat, and a couple of these have been answered while we've had the presentation. But I wanted to just pick a couple out to start, and I think Mary Lou and Peggy Moretti asked questions about the model and how it does or does not take into account the impact of demolishing the existing building. So does this model measure the embodied energy that is lost when an existing building is demolished? And I'll let Aaron, you or Lori or Larry, if he wants to chime in, answer that.
Yeah, I'm going to let Lori or Larry take that one.
Well, I could start. First of all, when we're thinking about this, the embodied carbon that's in a building has already been spent. So you can't lose it again. You've already lost that carbon. It was made when you made the building. So what you're talking about really is what are the scenarios for avoiding new carbon in the future, whether by remodeling or a new building. So it doesn't really matter what's in the existing building. It matters what you're going to do to the building or what you're going to replace it with. That's where the new carbon emissions come in. So I think that's the way to think about it. The only thing that makes it relevant is that to upgrade an existing building that's a heavy concrete structure generally takes, especially if it needs some structural work, will take a lot more embodied carbon than renovating a light wood frame building. So that's where that comes into play. Generally, you're going to see more potential for savings by reusing and avoiding building heavy structures, heavy concrete and steel structures. If you can do that, you're getting kind of the most bang for your buck. There were some other questions about houses that I saw in here, like wood frame houses. There's still definitely a benefit, but there's so much lower embodied carbon to begin with that the savings won't generally be quite as great to reuse a house as it is to reuse a steel and concrete office building. The potential is just not there because the replacement building is much lighter. So Laura, you may want to add to that, but that's a first pass at that.
I don't know if I need to add. Well, I will add. I was going to say I don't need to, but I'll go ahead because I think there was another similar question in the chat about demolition impacts, and I think everything Larry said is true. And the data, one of the issues in making the tool was having a sort of uniform quality and reliability of the backend data, given that we had to pull from so many different sources. And so at the time we started the tool, there wasn't really great data about demolition impacts, and it can vary quite wildly depending on, for example, how far the waste has to be transported, where you are geographically, that kind of thing. So I think it originally was included, and Larry, you had made some assumptions about that number, and then we pulled it out at some point because we just didn't have as much confidence as that data as we had in the rest of the information in the tool. But we recognize that it's important, and it's certainly, I think, something that we're continuing to evaluate as the data, as there's more work done to develop information about the process.
So the takeaway there is that the tool measures and is designed to help us avoid future carbon emissions through reuse and retrofitting. The tool does not attempt to account for the carbon emissions of the demolition process itself, but that could be something you would add, right?
Right.
Okay. So another couple of questions kind of got into the issue of how big or how small the example needs to be for this tool to be most useful. And so I think someone asked, can you do this about a window replacement project, for example, not a full building replacement project, but pieces and parts of buildings, windows or whatever. Does it work there? Could it?
I'm going to say yes. I think, if you're talking about single, small scale interventions like just refurbishing windows or just replacing the MEP systems, you might not see really dramatic numbers across the different, bars of the chart, but it will be an effective tool to help you estimate the carbon impacts of even those small, those small projects.
The one thing the tool doesn't do yet, and we've talked about this a lot, and it's really difficult to do, is calculating the energy savings from the window replacement. You make your own estimates on where you think you can get to with a new EUI, an estimated EUI through energy upgrades and equipment upgrades, but it doesn't specifically take each upgrade and translate it into operational savings. And that's a pretty complicated thing to do. So you would assume that if you're going for a net zero building and you're not going to insulate the building or add new windows, you probably can't get there. So you actually know some things if that you're going to have to do some upgrades to get to a much improved, but it doesn't tell you exactly what they are yet, because it's too complicated for the tool right now.
Something I want to ask you guys to talk a little bit about is when it comes to operating emissions, a lot has to do with the kind of equipment that is either in an existing or in a new building. And we're hearing more and more about the move toward electrification of building systems, heating, cooling, using heat pumps in particular to allow buildings to go all electric. I guess I'd ask you to, perhaps Aaron, if you could tell us why that's important, that move to electrification, and then how you built that into the model. Is electrification part of the default? Or is it an option? And then how does that relate to the really important transition we're making, not at the building scale, but at the utility scale towards renewable, making our grid renewable? That's a really important context for this. So if you could explain.
Yeah, it really is. And yes, the answer is the tool does account for, or it does allow options for electrification, and it does allow options for renewable energy. I'll just show that again really quickly while I talk about it. So on each the building reuse and the new tab, you can say you're installing all electric systems and equipment is a long form for electrification. And then the amount of renewables is getting at that other side of it. But to answer your question, Jim, that is critical because, I mean, first, kind of from a really obvious perspective, if your equipment in your building is not electric, then it is almost necessarily fossil fuel equipment, so typically gas at this point. And we all know that gas equipment will always be emitting carbon and GHGs, and there is no way to change that. Whereas electricity has the potential to be 100% renewable and has potential to be completely decarbonized. So even if your electric grid isn't currently decarbonized, making sure that your building is ready when the electricity grid is clean, or when some sort of either on-site solar or off-site renewables is procured, is critical. It's a very similar concept to electric vehicles. But the really cool thing about electrification too is that electric equipment is at minimum 300% more efficient than gas equipment, and some of the newer heat pumps, et cetera, are even, I've heard numbers almost as high as 600%. And what that really translates into is that electrification is in and of itself an energy efficiency measure. It will reduce your building's energy consumption simply because the equipment is so much more efficient. So it's really, at least from an operational carbon perspective, a no-brainer. And Architecture 2030 is calling for all new construction to be fully decarbonized today, and which means, of course, using all electric equipment. And from a cost perspective, certainly for new construction too, it is at least on par, if not cheaper, in every part of the country, according to Rocky Mountain Institute. And then, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask if you could put up could you put up the visual of the tool and the outputs while you're talking for a second?
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry. There you go. Thank you.
Yep. So here's where that will come into play. And then from a renewable energy perspective, the grid is decarbonizing, and it will get to zero at some point, largely because renewable energy is now the cheapest source of new energy globally. But the building sector is the single biggest consumer of electricity, both in the country and globally. And so we have a huge opportunity to be a demand side driver of that decarbonization. So grids will decarbonize because policy will require them to, and most electric utilities will drag their feet and do that as slowly as they possibly can. And if the building sector becomes a significantly higher driver of that by either producing our own or by procuring new renewables that require additionality, we can kind of force the electricity grid and our utilities to decarbonize more quickly.
And the other thing to add to that is that when you click all electric systems or equipment, right now you'll see the output is impacted by what grid you selected, how clean the grid. If you go back to the first page and change the grid to a cleaner projection or make it that it will never change, you'll see those numbers change as you do that, which is really interesting.
That's one of the great things about this, is watching how each change you make impacts the results. And just
most states have a target for when they expect to be. You can actually look up the target and they say, well, California says it's going to be grid neutral by 2035 or whatever it is, and put that number in, and it'll change the output, which is really interesting.
And something to maybe just mention here, if you could keep that graph up there, Aaron, that we can see on the right. You know, one thing that strikes, I think, really clearly in here is the do nothing scenario is the one we do not want to select. So doing something is really important. And also, to your earlier point there, as the grid gets cleaner, the operational emissions are going to be a smaller and smaller part of the impacts. And the embodied carbon emissions are going to become increasingly important.
Exactly.
And I think that's where the reuse scenario really has some advantages. Just maybe one last question, and I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all of them, but this might allow you to look forward. One of the participants asked about policy applications here. Have you tested that anywhere, and how? And if you have, and maybe you can talk about where you think this might go in the policy arena, because it seems like it could be really powerful there.
Yeah, I mean, I think any one of us has a lot of thoughts on that. So we have big plans for both CARE tool expansion in and of itself, as well as a bigger kind of reuse program around that. We're calling it Reuse Plus, because you have to reuse, but you also have to upgrade, right? It's the two pieces of the coin. We think there are huge policy implications. Lori could talk about it more from a historic preservation context, but one of our biggest and highest demand goals is to turn or to create care for portfolios. So that analysis that Lori showed of the Agnes Scott campus, she did that manually using the CARE tool, but manually. We want to have an option where an entire campus, even an entire city, can input all of their building information in a spreadsheet, and it will output some sort of high-level analysis showing what the impact potential is. And the policy implications for that are myriad. And we have much more details about what our plans are for engaging with both private portfolio owners as well as public sector policymakers and planners. But we can see a lot of potential for including that in climate action plan goals and in carbon accounting. And in really, I mean, this tool, as far as any of us know, is the first tool out there that actually quantifies the reuse potential from a whole carbon perspective. And so you can imagine from a city planning perspective, for example, and policymaking perspective, having that actual quantification of the carbon impact of reusing buildings will make a huge difference in long-term planning.
Thank you. And Lori or Larry, any thoughts from your perspective on that, looking forward, what other ways this tool might be applied?
Yeah, I mean, a few quick ideas that we've heard from others are on the preservation front, for example, using CARE tool to link historic tax credits to climate goals, for example, to demonstrate the carbon avoided through historic tax credit projects in support of public, statewide of decarbonization targets, for example. Another is thinking about zoning, where many municipalities, for example, Boston, we have very strict sustainability requirements for review of projects. But if you're tearing down an old building to build a new one, it just looks at the new building. It doesn't look at what you've lost already. So I think it's really the first tool that, as Aaron, as you mentioned, that kind of allows embodied carbon and operational carbon to be looked at holistically, to really look at, again, at the holistic impacts of what we're doing to the built environment, rather than just talking about how much energy we're using.
Thank you, Lori. That's a perfect summary of the whole purpose of the tool as we hit the top of the hour. Well, I want to thank all of you, Lori, Larry, and Aaron, for your work on this and for your presentation today. Thanks to everybody for joining us. I know we didn't get to answer all the questions. We're going to do our best to respond to you post-webinar here. And if, Aaron, you could just put up our last slide reminder. We've got obviously more webinars coming up, and I know we're going to have one on historic tax credits and connections between historic tax credits and sustainability, as well as affordable housing, coming up at the end of June. So look for that one. And here's a summary as well. Another webinar coming up on June 21st on caring for grave sites. So thanks everybody very much for joining us today. More to come on this. Very exciting.
Thanks, everybody. Please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have questions. There is also, I forgot to mention, there's a user feedback section on the tool where you can provide both feedback and suggestions and questions, and they come directly to the three of us.
Excellent. Thanks all.
you.